The slip of paper had been folded so many times over 7 years that the creases had gone soft as worn cotton, and Nora Whitfield had kept it tucked inside the left heel of her boot, where it pressed against her foot with every single step she had ever taken since the day her mother pressed it into her palm and told her not to lose it, not ever, because it was the only thing standing between her and a life of pure nothing. She had read the name on that paper so many times she could see it behind her eyelids when she closed her eyes at night. Roscoe Bristol, 2 words written in her mother's careful hand, blue ink gone faded to the color of a winter sky. Roscoe Bristol. A man her mother had known briefly, a rancher in the New Mexico territory, a man with good land and a decent soul, a man who had once told her mother that if she ever needed something in this world, she should send word to Cielo Rojo and ask for him. Her mother had never sent word. But she had kept the paper, and when she died of fever in the spring of 1878, she had pressed it into Nora's hand with the last of her strength, and Nora had understood without being told that this was her inheritance. This name, this man she had never met. 7 years was a long time to carry a name in your boot. 7 years was a long time to hold onto a stranger. It was the spring of 1885 when Nora finally climbed down from the back of a supply wagon on the outskirts of a small New Mexico town called Cielo Rojo, a name that meant red sky in Spanish. And the sky above her when she landed in the red dirt was exactly that, a burning, brilliant crimson laced with the golds of early morning, the sun barely cresting the ridge of the mesa to the east. She was 26 years old, her dark hair pinned under a brown felt hat, her blue dress road-worn and dusty at the hem, her left boot heel carrying 7 years of hope and uncertainty in a folded square of faded paper. She had come from Missouri. She had walked, ridden, begged wagon space, and done honest work in 4 different towns along the way, taking laundry and mending jobs to keep herself fed, sleeping in boarding houses when she had the coins and in church vestibules when she did not. She had crossed rivers swollen with spring rain and ridden through a dust storm so thick she could not see the ears of the mule she was sitting behind. She had been propositioned twice by men whose intentions were not good, and both times she had straightened her spine and stared them down with the kind of quiet ferocity that had kept her alive through 7 years of hardship. She had survived. She had always survived. But she was tired now, bone-tired in the way that only a long road can make a person, and when her feet touched the red earth of Cielo Rojo, she stood very still for a moment and breathed. The town was modest. A main street of hard-packed dirt, a general store, a saloon called the Mesa Rose, a livery stable, a small church with a bell tower that leaned slightly to the left, a smithy where she could already hear the ring of early morning work beginning. There were houses beyond the main street. She could see their rooftops, and beyond the houses were fields, and beyond the fields was open range that went on until it met the flat-bottomed sky. It was beautiful in the stark, uncompromising way of the desert west, all rust and ochre and sage-green, nothing soft about it except the light. She asked the supply wagon driver, a heavy-set man named Mr. Aldous Finch who had let her ride from the previous town of Dulce Creek in exchange for cooking his meals at camp, where she might find a man named Roscoe Bristol. Aldous Finch scratched the back of his neck and squinted at her. "Bristol," he said, like he was turning the name over to check it for quality. "You mean the rancher, out on the East Pasture Road." "I don't know what road," she said honestly. "I only know he is supposed to be here." "He's here all right," Aldous said, and something in his voice suggested he had an opinion about Roscoe Bristol, but was polite enough not to share it with a woman who had clearly traveled hard. "Follow the main street east until it turns to dirt road. About half a mile out you'll see a well on the left side of the road before you reach the gate. That well sits on his property line. He draws water there most mornings." "Most mornings," she repeated. "Every morning as far as I know," Aldous said, and gave her a look that suggested this was the sort of reliability that either impressed or bored a person depending on who they were. Man is regular as sunrise. She thanked him, retrieved her leather travel bag from the back of the wagon, and started east. The morning was young enough that the air still held the night's coolness, though she knew from the quality of the light that by midday the heat would be formidable. Her boots crunched on the red dirt. Around her, the desert was waking up slowly, a quail calling from somewhere in the scrub brush, a jackrabbit disappearing between two boulders, the distant low sound of cattle from somewhere beyond the ridge. She walked with her bag over her shoulder and her hat pulled forward, and she did not let herself think too hard about what was about to happen, because thinking too hard about it had a way of turning her courage wobbly at the edges. She had composed and discarded 100 versions of what she would say to him. She had imagined him old and gnarled and not particularly welcoming. She had imagined him young and suspicious. She had imagined him married with a wife who would look at her with narrow eyes, and know immediately what kind of desperation had driven a woman to cross half the country with a stranger's name in her boot. She had imagined all of these things, and then told herself to stop imagining and just walk, because the walking was the only thing she could actually control. The road turned from packed gravel to soft dirt just as Aldous had said, and she could see the open range spreading out on either side, the distant shimmer of green where irrigation had coaxed grass from the resistant earth. There was a line of fence posts running parallel to the road, pale wood in the morning light, and ahead she could see where the road bent slightly, and just at the bend, perhaps 50 yards from her, she saw the well. It was a good well, built of stacked stone in a neat circle about 3 feet high, with a wooden crosspiece and a rope and bucket. The kind of well someone had built carefully, with intention, the kind that would last. And there was a man standing at it. She stopped walking. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and dark trousers tucked into worn boots. He had a hat on, a battered brown hat with a wide brim that shadowed his face, and he was working the rope of the well, pulling up the bucket with the practiced ease of someone who had done this particular thing so many times his muscles did it without asking his mind for permission. He poured the water into a trough that she hadn't noticed, a long wooden trough sitting on the ground beside the well, and then he set the bucket back and straightened up and reached for a cloth hanging from the stone lip of the well to wipe his hands. It was in that moment, while he was wiping his hands and not yet looking at her direction, that Nora's heart did something complicated inside her chest. It wasn't quite fear and it wasn't quite hope, and it was somewhere in the territory between the two where the most important things in life always seem to live. She started walking again. He heard her before he saw her, the crunch of her steps on the dirt road, and he turned and she saw his face. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or two either side of that, with a lean, weathered face that spoke of long days in the open sun, and a jaw that was clean-shaved, which surprised her somehow, and dark eyes beneath the brim of his hat that were the same color as good coffee. He looked at her the way men in the West tended to look at strangers coming down the road, direct and assessing and not unfriendly, the look of someone who had learned that most people on the road were not trouble but had also learned not to assume that on faith alone. She stopped about 10 feet from him. "Are you Roscoe Bristol?" she asked, and her voice came out steadier than she had expected it to. He studied her for a moment. "I am," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who did not speak unless he meant to. "My name is Nora Whitfield," she said. "My mother was Clara Whitfield. She told me before she died that if I ever needed a place in this world, I should come find you and tell you her name. She said you would understand." Something moved across his face. It was a complex movement, like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples going outward in several directions at once. He took a slow breath and held it for a moment and then released it. "Clara Whitfield," he said, like he was identifying something he had set down a long time ago and was only now picking up again to look at. "I knew her, briefly, A long time ago, he paused. She's gone. 7 years passed, Nora said. In the spring of 1878, fever. Took that in quietly, the way a good man takes in news of loss without deflecting it. I'm sorry to hear it, he said. She was a kind woman. He looked at Nora more carefully now, taking in the dust on her dress, the worn leather of her bag, the look in her eyes that she knew well enough to know it was visible. You came from Missouri. I did. How long have you been on the road? She considered lying and then decided there was no percentage in it. 3 months, more or less. I worked my way west. He set the cloth down on the stone lip of the well and looked at her with those coffee-dark eyes, and she could not tell what he was thinking except that it was serious. Have you eaten this morning? She had eaten a heel of bread at dawn from what was left of Aldous Finch's camp provisions, but it had been a small thing. Not much, she admitted. Then come up to the house, he said simply, as if the matter were settled, as if a woman appearing out of the dawn road with nothing but her name and her mother's name and a piece of folded paper in her boot was the most ordinary thing in the world. She was not sure what she had expected from him. She was not sure that this simple, direct decency was it. But she picked up her bag and fell into step beside him as he led her up the road toward the gate, and she thought that perhaps her mother had known something she hadn't. The ranch house was not grand, but it was solid, built of adobe brick in the southwestern style, with a wide covered porch running across the front, and a good tin roof and windows with wooden shutters that were propped open to catch the morning breeze. There was a kitchen garden to one side, neat rows of what looked like beans and squash, and something leafy she couldn't immediately identify, and a small flower bed along the porch that had clearly been recently tended. There were outbuildings beyond the main house, a barn, a stable, what looked like a tool shed, and in the distance a corral where 3 horses stood in the morning light watching the world with the mild philosophical interest of horses who had seen most things and found them tolerable. A man was crossing from the barn toward the house when they came through the gate, and he stopped when he saw Nora. He was older than Roscoe, perhaps 50, with a broad brown face and a graying mustache, and the deliberate movements of someone whose knees had put in many years of honest labor. He looked at Nora without surprise, but with a kind of alert attention. "Hector," Roscoe said, "this is Miss Nora Whitfield. She's just arrived from a long road. She'll be staying for a while." He said this last part without looking at Nora, which was just as well because she was not sure what expression was on her face when she heard it. He said it with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided and saw no particular need to make a production of the decision. "Nora, this is Hector Reyes. He's been with this ranch longer than I have." Hector Reyes nodded at her with the careful courtesy of a man who understood how to treat a woman who had been on a hard road. "Welcome to Cielo Rojo, Miss Whitfield," he said. "I'll put water on." Inside the house was clean and spare, the way a bachelor's house tends to be when the bachelor is organized by nature rather than by habit. Everything had a place, nothing was unnecessary, but there was evidence of genuine habitation in the small details. A worn armchair by the front window with a book face down on its arm, a row of leather-bound ledgers on a shelf above the fireplace, a pair of work gloves folded on the mantel, a coffee cup still sitting on the long wooden table in the kitchen that someone had washed and set to dry and then forgotten to put away. The kitchen was large and practical, a cast-iron stove, a deep stone sink, shelves with provisions, a table and 4 chairs. Roscoe hung his hat on a peg by the door and ran a hand through his hair, which was dark and needed a cut, and fell in a slightly unruly way across his forehead. Without the hat he looked younger and somehow more readable. He pulled out a chair at the table for her and she sat, and she set her bag down at her feet, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Tell me about yourself," he said, sitting across from her, leaning forward on his forearms in a way that said he was genuinely asking. "Where have you been these 7 years since your mother passed?" So she told him. She had never told anyone the full story before because there had never been anyone who asked with that kind of sincere attention, but she told him now. sitting at his kitchen table, while Hector Reyes moved around the stove putting coffee on and slicing bread, and the morning light came through the east window and lay across the table in a long golden bar. She told him about the boarding house in St. Louis where she had worked for 3 years as a laundress, about the seamstress shop in Kansas City where she had learned to sew properly, and saved enough money to buy herself a good pair of boots, about the hard winter of 1881 when the money had run out, and she had nearly decided to give up on the idea of Cielo Rojo altogether, and then had pulled herself back from that particular edge by reminding herself of the paper in her boot. She told him about the decision to finally make the journey, and about the 3 months of it, and about Aldous Finch and his wagon. Roscoe listened to all of it without interrupting, which was a quality she had rarely encountered in a man, the ability to hear a long story without feeling the need to insert himself into it at intervals to prove he was following along. He just listened, and his face was attentive and serious, and occasionally something shifted in it that she thought might be the near surface of an emotion he was not going to name. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Hector set coffee in front of them both, and bread with butter and a crock of something dark that turned out to be a sweet bean preserves she had never tasted before, but that was remarkable. And then Hector moved to the far end of the kitchen to give them the privacy of distance without leaving entirely. "You've been carrying my name for 7 years," Roscoe said finally. He said it slowly, like he was feeling the weight of it. "In your boot." She looked at him steadily. "My mother told me not to lose it." "I didn't lose it." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I want you to know something. I told your mother, and I meant it genuinely. It wasn't an empty thing, that if she needed help, there was a place for her here. I didn't know she had a daughter. I didn't know she was sick." He paused. "I'm glad you came. I want you to know that. Whatever you need, whether it's a season to rest and gather yourself or something more permanent, there's room here." She looked at him. She was not a woman who cried easily. 7 years of hardship had done nothing to make her so. But there was something about the plain directness of what he said that made her throat tight in a way she had not anticipated. "I'm not looking for charity," she said, and there was more firmness in her voice than she intended. "I know you're not," he said without any impatience. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering work and room and board if you want it. The garden needs someone who knows what they're doing. Hector manages most things, but neither of us is particularly skilled with the kitchen beyond the basics. And there's mending and sewing work that has gone unattended longer than I'd like to admit." A brief pause. "And I'm offering it because your mother was someone worth knowing, and you've shown considerable determination in getting here. Those are the reasons, not pity." She believed him. She was not sure why she believed him so readily, except that she had spent 7 years developing a reliable instinct for people's intentions, and everything about Roscoe Bristol said what he meant and meant what he said. It was rare. It was disarming. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He nodded, satisfied, and reached for his coffee. "Eat your bread," he said. "Then I'll show you where you'll sleep." The room she was given was small and clean, and had a window that looked out over the kitchen garden and beyond it, toward the open mesa. There was a narrow bed with a proper mattress, a washstand with a basin and a pitcher, a small chest of drawers, and a wooden hook on the wall for her dress and coat. It was more than she had had in years. She sat on the edge of the bed after Roscoe had shown her the room and left her to it, and she reached down and unlaced her left boot, and she dug out the folded slip of paper from the heel where she kept it. She unfolded it. The paper was soft as cloth from years of folding and unfolding, the ink faded, the creases permanent. Roscoe Bristol, it said in her mother's handwriting, and then below it a town and territory, Cielo Rojo, New Mexico. She had arrived. She sat there with the paper in her hands and felt the particular strangeness of having reached a destination she had held in her imagination for so long that the reality of it was almost impossible to hold. She had done it. She was here. And the man whose name she had carried was not what she had imagined, and more than she had hoped, and she could not yet determine what any of it meant except that she was exhausted and safe, and she intended to sleep. She folded the paper again, more carefully than usual, and set it on top of the chest of drawers instead of putting it back in her boot. Then she lay back on the bed with her boots still on and was asleep within minutes. She slept until early afternoon. When she woke, she felt disoriented in the way of someone in an unfamiliar place, and then she heard the sound of the ranch below her window and remembered where she was, and the feeling that came with remembering was complicated and warm and not unpleasant. She washed her face and tidied her hair and changed her dress to the other one she had brought, a plain gray one that was less dusty than the blue, and she went downstairs and found the kitchen empty. She could hear voices outside, so she went out the back door and into the kitchen garden, and there she found Hector Reyes crouching among the bean rows doing something to the soil at the base of the plants. He looked up when she appeared. "Sleep well?" he asked. "Very well," she said. "What do you need done?" He looked at her with something she thought was approval. "The squash on the east end want water. There's a bucket by the pump." She rolled up her sleeves and went to work. She learned the rhythms of the ranch in the days that followed. She learned that Roscoe rose before dawn without exception, drew water from the well, fed the horses before anything else, and then came in for coffee, which he took black and drank in silence, standing at the kitchen window looking out at the morning. She learned that he was a man of few unnecessary words, but that the words he did say were worth listening to. She learned that he had come to New Mexico territory from Texas 7 years ago, which put his arrival in the territory roughly coincident with the period when her mother had known him briefly, and she wondered about that but didn't ask. She learned that he ran cattle, a modest herd, and that he had 2 ranch hands besides Hector, a young man named Pedro Vasquez who was 18 and serious about his work, and an older hand called Fenn, who was perhaps 45, a lean man who barely spoke but who could read the weather in the sky better than anyone she had ever met. She learned that Roscoe had a very slight limp in his left leg that he did not discuss, and that did not slow him down appreciably, but that she noticed the way you notice small things about people you are beginning to pay close attention to. She learned that he read in the evenings, history mostly, and occasionally poetry, which surprised her, and she filed that surprise away in the part of her mind where she was gradually building a more accurate picture of who he was. What she did not learn immediately, what took longer, was anything about why he was alone. He had been here 7 years and there was no wife, no children, no evidence of a woman's presence in the house beyond the kitchen garden, which Hector told her Roscoe had planted himself after reading something about it in an agricultural periodical. He had not been going to ask. She had not been going to ask either for the first while. It was not her business, and she understood privacy. But the days accumulated, and with them the small interactions that make up the fabric of a life shared in close proximity. She cooked breakfast and supper, and he thanked her every time with the same quiet sincerity, which was not something she had ever taken for granted in a man. She mended the pile of shirts and trousers that had been sitting in a basket in the corner of the main room for what appeared to be months, and when she handed them back, he looked at them with genuine relief. She reorganized the kitchen stores in a way that was more logical for cooking, and he noticed and commented on it. She fixed a broken shutter hinge on the east window while he was out in the pasture one afternoon, and when he came in and saw it, he looked at it and then looked at her, and there was something in the look that she could not precisely name but that settled in her chest like warmth. He was not unaware of her. She knew that. She could feel it the way you feel sunlight even when you are not looking directly at it, a constant peripheral warmth. When she spoke, he listened with his full attention. When she moved through a room, he tracked her with his eyes in the way that was not disrespectful but was simply attentive, the way a man watches someone who interests him. But he did not press forward. He was patient in a way that she was beginning to understand, was native to his character rather than reluctance, and she appreciated it even as some part of her found it both baffling and endearing. 3 weeks after her arrival, she was sitting on the front porch in the early evening sorting dried beans from a burlap sack into a bowl when he came and sat down in the other chair, which he did not always do. Usually he stood at the porch rail when he came out in the evenings, but tonight he sat, and he stretched his left leg out slightly, which she had noticed he sometimes did when it bothered him, and he looked out at the mesa turning colors in the last of the day's light. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a while. "Go ahead," he said. "Why did you tell my mother there was a place for her here? You said you knew her briefly. What was the circumstance?" He was quiet for a moment, not in the way of someone avoiding the question, but in the way of someone choosing how to answer it honestly. "I was in Missouri briefly in 1877, he said. "I was doing business there, nothing significant. Your mother ran a small eating establishment, a boarding table for travelers. I ate there several times over the course of a week. She was," he paused, searching for the word generous, "in the true sense. She fed people who couldn't pay and told them not to concern themselves with it. She talked to everyone like they were worth talking to." He looked at the mesa. "When I left, I told her that if she ever found herself in need of a fresh start, New Mexico was a good country for it and she could come to me. I meant it. I've often meant things that people didn't believe I meant." A brief pause. "She must have believed it." "She kept your name for a year before she died," Nora said. "She never used it, but she kept it." "Stubbornly self-sufficient," he said. "Yes," Nora said, with a soft laugh that surprised her a little because she had not expected to find it funny, and yet she did because it was so precisely true. "Yes, exactly that." He looked at her when she laughed, and something in his expression shifted into something gentler, more open, like a door that had been nearly closed and now stood wider. "You have that quality as well," he said, and then looked back at the mesa, as if he had said something that required a moment of repositioning. She looked at the side of his face and thought about what it meant to carry a name for 7 years, and to arrive and find the man attached to that name was the kind of man who said things like that. She thought about the paper on her chest of drawers, which she had not yet put back in her boot because there was no longer any need. She was where the paper had been directing her all along. She went on sorting beans, and he sat with her until the light went entirely, and when she stood to go in she noticed that his hand, resting on the arm of his chair, was very close to where hers had been, and she did not know whether that was intention or coincidence, and she thought about it later in the dark while she was trying to sleep. The trouble came in May, about 6 weeks after her arrival, and it did not come in a dramatic form. It came in the form of a man named Calvin Trask, who arrived on a Thursday morning while Roscoe was out in the north pasture with the cattle, and who presented himself at the gate with the practiced smile of a man who used smiling as a tool rather than an expression. Calvin Trask was a land agent, or so he claimed, representing interests he called a development consortium from back east, and he wanted Roscoe Bristol's land, or at least a portion of it, because there was apparently something significant about the water rights attached to Roscoe's section, and the consortium was very interested in those rights and had money to offer. Nora happened to be in the kitchen garden when he arrived and came to the gate because Hector was down at the stable. She did not trust Calvin Trask on sight. She was aware that this might be ungenerous. She was also aware, having spent 7 years moving through the world alone, that her instincts about people were rarely wrong. He was perhaps 40, well-dressed for the territory in a way that said he had dressed carefully for effect, and his eyes moved over the property with an appraising quality that he tried to disguise as casual interest, and did not quite succeed. He was polite to her in the slick way that said he had decided she was not important, that she was probably a housekeeper or ranch hand's wife, someone who could be spoken pleasantly to, and then gotten past to find whoever actually mattered. She told him Roscoe was not available and he should come back. He asked when Mr. Bristol would be available. She told him she could take a message. He smiled again and said he would call back in the afternoon, and she watched him ride back toward town on a good horse and thought that the horse was probably the most honest thing about him. She told Roscoe about the visit when he came in for the midday meal. She told him everything she had observed, which was considerable, including the way Trask's eyes had spent a full 30 seconds on the well by the road before he said goodbye. Roscoe listened to all of it without interruption, as he always did. When she finished, he put down his fork and looked at her in a way that was thoughtful and also, she noticed, somewhat impressed. "You notice things," he said. "I have had to," she said. He nodded. "He's not the first," he said. "There have been 2 others in the past year, men representing Eastern money. They all want the water rights." He paused. "This land has a spring on it, underground. The flow comes up in that well and in 2 other spots on the property. It's reliable water in a country where reliable water is valuable enough to kill for, and everyone seems to have become aware of that fact at the same time." "Have you been getting any threats?" she asked directly, because she had learned that directness with him got better results than working around things. "Nothing explicit," he said, "but there have been fence lines cut on the north section twice in the past 3 months. A section of the south road was blocked with rocks in a way that looked deliberate. Nothing I can prove." She looked at him. "And you're out on the property most of the day by yourself or with only one other person," she said. "I usually am," he agreed, not sounding particularly concerned, which she was beginning to understand was a quality of his personality rather than a failure to comprehend the situation. He simply did not panic. She found this both reassuring and occasionally frustrating. "You need to be more careful," she said. He looked at her with those coffee-dark eyes, and there was a flicker of something that she would have called amusement, except that it was warmer than amusement. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and his mouth curved very slightly, and she was aware that this was the closest she had seen to a full smile on him, and she felt it in a way that was disproportionate to the cause. Calvin Trask came back that afternoon and spoke with Roscoe on the porch for 45 minutes. Nora stayed inside but within earshot, not because she was eavesdropping, which she had decided was not dignified, but because she was near the window doing mending and the window was open. What she heard satisfied her worst instincts about Calvin Trask. He was offering money, and it was good money, more than the land was worth on paper, but the offer was structured in a way that would have given his consortium effective control of the water rights while leaving Roscoe the nominal owner of the land itself. It was a sophisticated thing, the kind of thing that probably worked on people who did not read their own contracts carefully. Roscoe declined it. He declined it in his characteristic way, which was to say no in a tone that made it very clear no further conversation on the subject was invited, without raising his voice or making threats. Calvin Trask was charming about it and said he understood and that the offer stood and he would be in touch, and he rode away and Roscoe came inside and sat down at the table. Nora set a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked. "He will not give up after one no," she said. "No," Roscoe agreed, picking up the coffee. "He will not." "Do you have a lawyer in town?" He looked at her. "I do not." "You should, especially if there's going to be a sustained effort to acquire your water rights. You need someone who can advise you properly on the legal side of it, and who can represent you if it comes to that." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the impression he was reconsidering something. "The nearest lawyer is in Santa Fe," he said. "A man named Oliver Crane. I've had dealings with him before. I'll write to him." "Write tonight," she said. "Don't put it off." He looked at her again with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that said he was registering something about her that he had not fully anticipated. "All right," he said. "I'll write tonight." She nodded and went back to her mending, and he drank his coffee, and the silence between them was the kind that had become comfortable over the weeks, an easy, companionable quiet that felt like something they had earned together. It was on a Saturday evening in the 3rd week of May that the thing between them that had been quietly building finally broke the surface, and it happened in the most ordinary possible way, which seemed right, because Roscoe Bristol was not a man whose significant moments arrived with fanfare. He had been out since before first light, and something had gone wrong with one of the cattle, a situation that had required Roscoe and Hector and both ranch hands to spend the better part of the day dealing with. And when he came in near sunset, he was tired in a way he did not often show, the kind of tired that goes down to the core. He washed up at the sink and sat at the kitchen table, and Nora put supper in front of him, the same way she did every evening, but this time she noticed the set of his shoulders and the way he held the fork as he started eating, and without thinking about it, she reached across and put her hand briefly on his arm. Just for a moment. Just the gentle pressure of her hand on his forearm where his sleeve was rolled up. He went still. Not tensed, not pulling away, but still, the way someone goes still when they feel something that matters. She started to pull her hand back, suddenly uncertain whether she had overstepped, but his hand came up and covered hers before she could, and he held it there against his forearm for a long moment before either of them moved or spoke. "Nora," he said, just her name. But the way he said it was its own complete sentence. She looked at him. He was looking back at her, and there was nothing guarded in his face now, none of the careful patience he wore like a second skin, just something open and direct and unmistakably clear. "You don't have to say anything," she said quietly. "I want to say something," he said. "I've been trying to find the right way to say it for a while now." He paused, and she could see him choosing words with the same care he brought to everything. "I didn't know what to expect when you came down that road. I know what your mother was, and I know something of what you've been through to get here. And I told myself I wasn't going to make your being here about anything except giving you a proper place to land." He looked at her steadily. "But you're not easy to be around in the way I expected. I expected someone who needed help. I didn't expect someone who," another pause, "who makes the whole shape of the day feel different." She was very still. "Different how?" "Better," he said simply. "Different better." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 7 years. She thought about the paper in her boot, and the way she had walked with it pressing against her heel, and the way she had sometimes pulled it out and read his name by lamplight in whatever boarding house she was sleeping in. Not because she needed to remember the name. She had it memorized, but because there had been something comforting in the act of it, the reminder that there was a direction, a destination, a person in the world she was heading toward. She had not allowed herself to imagine that the heading toward and the arriving at would feel like this. 7 years is a long time to carry a person, she said, without knowing who they are. "And now you know who I am," he said. "I'm beginning to," she said. "I find that I like what I'm finding." His thumb moved against the back of her hand once, a small motion, but it felt enormous in the quiet of the kitchen. "I would like to court you properly," he said, with the kind of formal gravity that she found deeply touching because it told her exactly the kind of man he was. "If that's something you would be willing to consider." She thought about it for a heartbeat. Then she said, "I have been sitting in a rocking chair at the end of your porch every evening for 3 weeks watching the sun go down. You have sat in the other chair. We have talked about everything from soil composition to the history of New Mexico territory, and I find I look forward to those evenings more than I have looked forward to anything in a very long time." She paused. "I think the courting may already be underway, Roscoe." He looked at her for a moment, and then he smiled. Not the brief curved thing she had seen before, but a real smile, wide enough to reach his eyes and change the whole quality of his face, and it was a remarkable thing to see, and she was deeply glad she was the one who had put it there. "I suppose that's true," he said. She squeezed his arm and then let go, and she passed him the bread, and they ate supper together in the warm kitchen, while the last of the light died outside the windows and the stars came up over the mesa, and everything felt both newly settled and newly started, the way things do when you finally stop walking towards something and arrive. The subsequent weeks were the best of Nora's life, which was not something she had expected to be able to say, and which she therefore regarded with some combination of gratitude and cautious disbelief. The days had a shape and a texture now that they had not had before, not just because she had a place and a purpose, but because there was a person in that place who was actively glad that she was in it. That was not something she had had in a long time. It changed things in ways that were both large and almost imperceptibly small. Roscoe was a deliberate courtier. He did not rush. He brought her wild desert flowers once, a small handful of something purple that grew in the arroyos, which he clearly felt somewhat self-conscious about because he left them on the kitchen table with a brief note rather than presenting them in person, and then was deeply embarrassed when she thanked him for them over supper, which she found endearing beyond all proportion. He asked her to ride out with him on Sunday afternoons, and she rode the gentlest of his 3 horses, a roan mare named Corazon, and he showed her the land, the spring that fed the well, the north pasture where the cattle grazed on the far side of a rocky ridge, the stands of juniper and pinon pine that ran along the eastern boundary of his property, the place where the land dropped down into a wide, shallow canyon that turned gold in the afternoon light. She fell in love with the land the way she had not expected to fall in love with anything, openly and completely. And she told him so one Sunday afternoon when they had stopped at the edge of the canyon to let the horses drink from a stream that ran along the canyon floor. She said she had never lived anywhere that felt like it was breathing, and he looked at her with that attentive expression that she had come to know as his version of delight, and said that was exactly how he had felt when he first rode through this country, and why he had stayed. They talked on those rides the way people talk when they are learning each other, and the learning is a pleasure rather than a duty. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, about her father who had left when she was 7, and whom she barely remembered, about the various lodgings she and her mother had occupied, about the books she had managed to read over the years, borrowed from libraries and lending shelves in boarding houses. He told her about Texas, where he had grown up on another man's ranch and learned everything he knew about cattle and land management, and the endless labor of making something good from something raw. He told her about the injury that had given him his limp, a fall from a horse during a cattle drive in 1879, his leg broken badly and set only adequately, which was why it still troubled him in the cold. He told her this without drama, the way he told everything, as simple fact, and she appreciated that he did not perform suffering. He told her about the decision to come to New Mexico and buy his own land, which had taken everything he had earned in 10 years, every saved coin, and which had been the most frightening thing he had ever done and which had been right. "I've never regretted it," he said, looking out over the canyon. "Not once, even when it was hard." "What made it hard?" she asked. "Isolation sometimes," he said. He paused for a moment. "I don't mind my own company, but there are times when you want someone to talk to at the end of the day, someone whose opinion on things matters to you." He glanced at her, brief and direct. "I've been missing that." She held his gaze. "So have I," she said. The weather turned hot in June, the way it does in New Mexico, a dry, fierce heat that rose off the red earth and made the air shimmer above the mesa. Nora adapted to it better than she expected, partly because she was busy enough that she didn't have time to find it miserable, and partly because the evenings brought a relief that was almost physical, the air cooling quickly once the sun went down, the stars appearing in a sky so clear and dark that she could see more of them than she had ever believed existed. Calvin Trask made his second visit in the middle of June, and this time he was not alone. He brought another man, introduced as his associate, a quieter man with a leather satchel who turned out to carry the revised offer document inside it. The offer was now structured differently, Nora noted as she listened from within, more aggressively, the language concerning the water rights tighter and more encompassing, and there was now a veiled suggestion in the way Trask spoke about the area's development that properties that did not participate in the consortium's plans might find themselves on the wrong side of the progress. Roscoe declined this offer as he had declined the first one, with the same unhurried certainty. After they left, he wrote his second letter to Oliver Crane in Santa Fe, and this time he also wrote to the county land office to make certain his property records were clearly filed and current. He also rode into town and had a brief conversation with the sheriff, a man named Sheriff Aldred Gomes, a compact man of about 45 who had been the law in Cielo Rojo for 12 years and who listened to Roscoe's account of the situation and said he would keep his attention on it. Nora went with Roscoe on his errand to town that day, the first time she had been properly in Cielo Rojo since her arrival. The town was small but not without a genuine community in it, and she could feel that community the way you feel the texture of a place when you walk through it with someone who belongs to it. People knew Roscoe by name and greeted him with the straightforward warmth of neighbors who have determined over time that someone is reliable and worth the warmth. They looked at Nora with the open curiosity of small-town people, not unpleasantly, just the natural interest of a place where everyone's business is broadly known, and a new person is a genuine development. At the general store, a woman named Maggie Caldwell, who was perhaps 50 and ran the store with her husband, looked Nora up and down and said cheerfully, "So you're the one who's been putting flowers in that kitchen garden out on the Bristol place. Hector Reyes told me you'd come. I'm glad someone's put proper attention into that garden. Roscoe grows things, but he has no instinct for what should go where." She said this entirely without malice, and then offered Nora a peppermint from a jar on the counter, which Nora accepted, and they were something like friends from that point forward. It was Maggie Caldwell who told her, a few visits later, that there was a quilting circle that met on Friday afternoons in the church hall, and that they had been wondering if Nora might want to join. Nora said she would be glad to, and found when she went that it was a circle of 7 women ranging in age from 20 to 70, 3 of them of Mexican heritage whose families had been in the territory for generations, and whose knowledge of the land was encyclopedic, 2 of them Anglo settlers who had come west in the same time period as Roscoe, and Maggie herself, and a woman named Ruth Abernathy who had come from Georgia 10 years ago and who still had a slight accent and opinions about everything. It was an excellent group. Nora attended every Friday after that. It was at the quilting circle that she heard more about Calvin Trask's activities in the region, because women in small western towns know more about the actual workings of things than is sometimes credited to them, and the collective intelligence of 7 women who paid close attention was formidable. 2 other ranchers in the area had also been approached by Trask's consortium, she learned. One had sold, reluctantly, after what sounded like sustained pressure that had included a ruined irrigation ditch. The other, a man named Vicente Herrera who ran sheep on the south section of the valley, had not sold and had been having fence trouble similar to Roscoe's. She brought all of this information home to Roscoe that Friday evening, delivered at the kitchen table with the systematic clarity of someone who had organized their thoughts on the ride back from town. He listened with increasing attention, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "You found all this out at the quilting circle," he said. It was not quite a question. "Women talk," she said. "And they notice things that men don't notice because men often don't believe that women's observations are worth asking about." He looked at her steadily. "I believe your observations are worth asking about." "Yes," she said, "you do. That's one of your better qualities." His mouth curved in that way she had come to love. "One of," he said. "One of several," she said. "I am keeping a list." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her across the table, and then he said, "Nora." He said it in the way that preceded something important, and she felt the particular alertness that word produced in her, the attentiveness to what was coming. "Roscoe," she said, "I have been thinking about what I want to say to you," he said, "for a while now. I've been thinking about it in the way I think about most things, which is to say, slowly and carefully. And I've arrived at the point where I don't think more time is going to improve upon it, so I'm going to say it." She waited. "I love you," he said, simply, completely, with no theatrical inflection, but with the kind of direct, open honesty that she had come to understand was what love looked like when it came from a man who meant everything he said. "I didn't expect to say that to anyone. I hadn't expected to be in the position where I wanted to. And then you came down that road with the sunrise at your back, and everything I thought I understood about what was missing from my life rearranged itself. She was very still. The kitchen was warm and quiet around them. Outside the window she could hear the soft movement of the evening wind through the kitchen garden. "Roscoe," she said. Her voice was quieter than usual. "I came here with a name in my boot. I came here because I had nowhere else to go and because my mother believed in you enough to write your name down. I wasn't coming here looking for love. I want you to know that. I wasn't coming with expectations." She paused. "But I have been in love with you since that Sunday afternoon at the canyon when you told me that you'd never regretted this land, not once, and I saw your face when you said it, and I thought, I would like to be someone that a man like that loves." A pause. "And then it turned out you already did, so I love you back. I love you very much." He stood up from the table and came around to her side, and she stood, and he took her face in his hands, calloused hands that were gentle with the same unconscious care he brought to everything, and he kissed her, and it was exactly the kind of first kiss that a deliberate man with a lot of feeling kept carefully contained would eventually produce. Thorough and serious and profound. When they separated, he kept his hands on her face and looked at her, and she looked back, and the kitchen around them was warm and the stars outside were beginning, and the smell of supper lingered in the air, and everything was, she thought, entirely right. The matter of Calvin Trask resolved itself not by any single dramatic confrontation, but by the slow accumulation of resistance that the consortium apparently had not anticipated encountering. Oliver Crane arrived from Santa Fe in July, a precise, sharply intelligent man of about 45, who spent 2 days reviewing Roscoe's property documents and water rights filings, and who told Roscoe over a very long evening at the kitchen table, with Nora also present because Roscoe had asked her to stay, and Oliver Crane was too professional to object, that the water rights as filed were solid, and that the consortium's offers, while substantial, were structured in ways that would effectively strip those rights in practical terms, even if Roscoe's name remained on the deed. Oliver Crane also discovered, through his professional connections in the territorial capital, that Calvin Trask's consortium had a history of this kind of approach in other territories, and that 2 of their previous acquisitions had been challenged legally with partial success by the original landowners. He wrote letters on Roscoe's behalf to the Territorial Land Office and copied the county sheriff, and he advised Roscoe to document every piece of fence cutting and road blocking and other interference he could connect to the consortium's activities. Sheriff Aldred Gomes, who had been watching the situation, did visit Calvin Trask in his temporary quarters at Cielo Rojo's small hotel, and had a conversation with him that Nora did not hear the details of but whose results she could observe in the fact that the fence cutting stopped entirely in the following weeks, and Calvin Trask's visits to the ranch ceased as well. Whether he moved on to easier targets or whether the consortium calculated the situation as not worth the trouble was something no one ever knew precisely, but by the end of July the immediate pressure had eased, and by August Oliver Crane reported that the consortium had withdrawn their filing interest from the territorial records entirely. "It's over," Nora asked Roscoe the evening he told her this. "For now," he said, with the practical realism that she had come to expect from him. "Land with reliable water will always attract interest, but the immediate threat is done." "Good," she said. "I was getting tired of worrying about it." He looked at her. "You were worrying about it." "Constantly," she said. "I hid it well." "You did," he agreed. "I noticed anyway." She looked at him. "You notice things too," she said. "You specifically," he said. "I notice you specifically." She reached across and took his hand, which she did now without thinking about it, the way you reach for something that belongs in your hand, and he held it in both of his, and they sat together on the porch in the last of the August heat while the mesa turned from red to purple to dark and the stars came out, enormous and bright and close in the desert sky. He asked her to marry him in September. He did it on a Sunday afternoon at the edge of the canyon, the same canyon where they had had the conversation about the land breathing, and she thought later that he had chosen the location deliberately, which was entirely consistent with who he was. The afternoon was golden and cool, the light beginning to change toward autumn, and the canyon below them was full of shadow and amber and the distant sound of the stream. He had clearly been thinking about what he was going to say for some time, because it came out carefully composed but without the stiffness of something overly rehearsed, more like something that had been lived with until it was ready. He said that he had spent a lot of his life being certain that he was the kind of man who would remain alone, not unhappily, but alone, and that the morning she had walked down the east road he had looked at her and felt the future change its shape. He said that he thought she was the most remarkable person he had ever met, and that he wanted to spend however many years remained to him, attempting to be worthy of her, and building something with her that was worth the building. He said he understood she had come from a long road, and that he did not take it for granted that she had arrived at him, and that he wanted to take care of the ground she had decided to stand on. Then he took a ring from his shirt pocket, a simple silver ring with a small turquoise stone, turquoise being a New Mexico stone, mined from the territory's own earth, and he held it out to her. She looked at the ring and then at him, and she thought about the paper in her boot and the morning at the well and everything between then and now, and she said yes, and she meant it completely. She wrote to no one because there was no one to write to. Her family was gone and her connections were the friends she had made in Cielo Rojo, at the quilting circle, at the church, the neighbors whose names she had learned, the woman named Maria Herrera, Vicent's wife, who had brought her a pot of stewed green chili in September and stayed for 2 hours talking in the kitchen. These people were her people now. This was her place. They were married in November, in the small church with the leaning bell tower, by the minister Reverend Thomas Grant, a kind man of 60 who had been in the territory long enough to have presided over more weddings than he could count, and who managed to make each one feel particular and unhurried. Hector Reyes stood beside Roscoe as his witness, and Maggie Caldwell stood beside Nora as hers, and the entire population of Cielo Rojo that was ambulatory came to watch because it was November, and there was not much else happening, and everyone liked a wedding. The church was decorated with dried flowers from the kitchen garden and sprigs of juniper, which Nora had arranged herself the day before, and the afternoon light came through the church windows at the angle that November light comes through church windows and lay across the floor in long pale bars, and Roscoe was standing at the front of the church when Nora walked down the aisle, and he was looking at her the way he always looked at her, with full attention and complete transparency, no performance in it. Just the genuine feeling of a man who knew exactly what he felt and was comfortable letting her see it. The vows they spoke were the traditional ones because Reverend Grant was a traditional man, but the way they were spoken was not traditional in the sense of being merely ceremonial. Roscoe said his vows slowly and clearly, each word landing with its full weight, and Nora said hers the same way. And when they were done, there was a moment before Reverend Grant pronounced them married where the church was completely quiet, and Nora felt that silence as something complete, as a full arrival, a coming to rest in the truest sense. When Roscoe kissed her, the assembled Cielo Rojo population made the approving noise that small Western communities produce when they have witnessed something they approve of, which is a sound that contains genuine goodwill and a certain amount of relief that things have turned out properly. And Nora laughed against Roscoe's mouth, and he laughed too, which was a new thing. His laughing, something she had been gradually uncovering over the months like finding water in the desert, unexpected and extraordinary. The celebration that followed was at the church hall, organized by Maggie Caldwell and Maria Herrera and 3 other women from the quilting circle, and it included food of such variety and abundance that it was clear people had been preparing for days, and there was fiddle music played by an old man named Santos Delgado, whose skill with the instrument was remarkable. And there was dancing on the wooden floor of the church hall, while the November wind came cold off the mesa outside, and inside was warm with lantern light and people, and the particular joy of a community that has found occasion to celebrate something good. Roscoe danced with Nora in the careful way of a man who has not danced much but is determined to do it correctly. And she danced with him, and thought that she did not care in the least whether he was correct about it. That dancing with him was simply the fact of being in his arms in a room full of their people with fiddle music and firelight, and that this was sufficient joy for one human life, and possibly more. Later that night, after the celebration was over and they had ridden back to the ranch in the cold dark with the stars very bright overhead, and the house was quiet and warm, Nora went upstairs to the room that was now their room, which she had been gradually making their room over the past months, her things alongside his things in the natural way of a life being joined to a life. She stood at the chest of drawers and opened the top drawer, and in the back corner of the drawer was the folded slip of paper. She picked it up. She held it for a moment. It was soft as cloth in her fingers, worn through years of being carried and unfolded and refolded. She opened it for the last time, Roscoe Bristol, her mother's handwriting, the name she had carried for 7 years. Roscoe came into the room and saw her standing with the paper in her hands. He came and stood beside her and looked at it with her, both of them looking at those 2 words in faded ink, and the room was quiet around them. "My mother was right," Nora said. "To give it to you," he said. "To believe you were worth finding," she said. He put his arm around her and held her against him, and she folded the paper one more time, the last time, and placed it back in the drawer. Not in her boot, not pressed against her heel with every step, but here in this drawer, in this room, in this house that was hers now as much as his. She did not need to carry it any further. She had arrived. The winter of 1885 was mild by New Mexico standards, which meant it was still cold enough to warrant keeping the fire burning in the evenings. But the snow came lightly and melted within days each time it fell, and the cattle wintered well, and Roscoe and Nora settled into the life of the ranch together with the ease of people who have discovered that their respective ways of being in the world are complementary in the ways that count. She had a talent for organization and for growing things, and for the kind of practical creative problem-solving that ranch life constantly demanded. He had a talent for the physical management of the land and the livestock, for the patience that cattle required and the forward planning that seasons required, and for the deeper philosophical steadiness of someone who had made peace with the fact that a life tied to the land was a life tied to things beyond your control, and who had found that acceptance freeing rather than defeating. Together they were better at all of it than either of them had been alone, which was the best possible evidence that the combination was a good one. By the spring of 1886, Nora knew she was carrying their first child. She told Roscoe on an April morning when the kitchen garden was just beginning to put out its new growth, and the mesa was turning green at the edges with the brief spring that the desert allowed, and he received the news in the way she had come to expect him to receive significant things, with a stillness that was not absence of feeling, but rather the opposite, the quality of a man whose feelings were deep enough that they required a moment to surface. Then he crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead, and then her mouth, and then he said, "Good," in a tone that made the single word enormous. She pressed her face against his shirt for a moment and felt his arms around her and thought that 7 years of walking had brought her to exactly here, and that exactly here was the most complete thing she had ever been part of. The pregnancy was not easy in every respect, as few pregnancies are, and the summer heat was fiercer than the previous one, but she was healthy and strong, and Dr. Fernando Aguilar, who practiced medicine in Cielo Rojo, and whose combination of formal training and long territorial experience made him well suited to the work, attended her regularly, and told her consistently that she was doing very well. Roscoe worried about her in the specific way of someone whose worry presents as increased attentiveness and the acquisition of every piece of relevant information that could be gathered, which meant he had also consulted Dr. Aguilar at considerable length and had arrived at an informed understanding of what to expect, which seemed to reassure him. Maria Herrera came by frequently, bringing food and practical knowledge, having had 4 children herself on a ranch with fewer resources than Roscoe's, and Maggie Caldwell appeared on the porch one afternoon with a crib she said she had been storing in the back of the store since the previous owners had left it, and that she had been waiting for the right occasion to pass on. Hector Reyes, who said very little about the pregnancy directly, quietly repaired the floorboards in the spare bedroom and put new glass in the window without being asked. Their son was born in February of 1887, on a cold, clear night with the stars sharp overhead and a fire burning in the bedroom fireplace, attended by Dr. Aguilar and Maggie Caldwell, who had appointed herself the person who would be there, and whom no one had any interest in contradicting. Roscoe was in the room the entire time, which Dr. Aguilar said was unusual but which Nora had required because she wanted him there and he had wanted to be there, and that was sufficient reason. She was in labor for 10 hours, which was long enough to exhaust her and short enough to be considered reasonable, and when it was over and Dr. Aguilar put the baby into her arms. The baby was a boy with dark eyes exactly like his father's, and a determined expression that both Dr. Aguilar and Maggie Caldwell agreed was extremely pronounced for a person who had been alive for under 3 minutes. Roscoe sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at his son with an expression on his face that Nora had never seen on him before, and that she would spend the rest of her life grateful to have witnessed, something entirely unguarded and vast. A man encountering the full fact of something he had not known he wanted until it was put into his hands. "What will we call him?" she asked. Roscoe looked at the baby for a moment. Then he said, James Elias Bristol." He glanced at her. "Elias was my father's name." "James Elias," she said. "Hello, James Elias." The baby regarded the ceiling with his father's dark eyes and seemed to find it acceptable. Hector Reyes, when told the news the next morning, nodded gravely and said that was a good name and then went out to the barn, and Nora was fairly certain she heard him laughing to himself on the way, which was the Hector Reyes equivalent of open celebration. The years that followed were full ones, the kind of years that are not measurable in dramatic events so much as in the steady accumulation of living. The ranch grew modestly, as Roscoe had planned carefully rather than ambitiously. A small addition to the cattle herd, better irrigation for the kitchen garden, a second bedroom added to the house. Pedro Vasquez, who had been their youngest ranch hand, married a woman named Isabella who was the school teacher in Cielo Rojo, and they brought their children to the ranch sometimes on Sundays, and James Elias Bristol ran with those children through the kitchen garden, with the terrifying energy of small boys who have not yet discovered the concept of consequences. Nora continued to go to the quilting circle on Friday afternoons, and her relationship with the women of that circle deepened into the kind of friendship that sustains a life, the kind where you know the full story and are trusted with the hard parts. Maria Herrera became her closest friend, a woman of great intelligence and warmth whose family had been in New Mexico since before it was a territory at all, and who knew the land with an intimacy that was itself a kind of knowledge Nora respected profoundly. They spoke honestly to each other about the realities of ranch life and marriage and motherhood, and the particular position of women in the West, where the labor was immense and the recognition of it often inadequate, and where you had to be clear about your own worth if you expected anyone else to be clear about it. Roscoe was clear about it. This was something she had known about him early, and that only became more evident with time. He regarded her work as being of equal importance to his own in the running of the ranch, and said so plainly when the occasion called for it, which in the West of the 1880s was not a universal quality in a husband, and she was aware of that and grateful for it. In 1889, the year New Mexico continued to push toward statehood amid ongoing territorial politics, Nora had their second child, another boy, born on a spring morning with considerably less drama than his brother, arriving into the world in apparent good humor and remaining so. They named him Daniel Clare Bristol, the middle name after a character in one of Roscoe's history books that Nora had begun reading and whose author she had found remarkable. James Elias, who was 2 by then, took an immediate proprietary interest in his brother, which expressed itself as a possessive hovering that Dr. Aguilar said was very natural and which Nora found both exhausting and touching. The ranch continued. The seasons continued. The well continued to draw water from the underground spring, reliable as it had always been, the same water that had made Calvin Trask's consortium covetous 7 years ago, the same water that had made this land worth the building. Hector Reyes, aging now but still working with the determination of a man who had no intention of becoming stationary while he still drew breath, told Nora one morning while they were both in the kitchen garden that he had worked for many men in his life, and that Roscoe Bristol was the best of them, which from Hector was the equivalent of a lengthy speech. Nora agreed and told him so. In 1891, Nora had a daughter, the third child, born in autumn when the cottonwood trees that grew along the creek bed turned gold, and the air had the sharp particular clarity of New Mexico fall. They named her Clara, for Nora's mother, and Roscoe held the name before they agreed on it and turned it over the way he turned over significant things, and then said that it was exactly right, and it was. Clara Bristol had her grandmother's name, and her mother's dark hair and her father's steady eyes, and she entered the household with the authority of a person who knew her own significance, which made both her brothers initially uncertain, and then devoted. Nora kept the slip of paper in the drawer of the chest in their bedroom. She never took it out again in the way she had taken it out in her mother's days, in the anxious way of someone navigating by it. But she knew it was there. She sometimes thought about it in the particular way you think about a thing that has been central to the shape of your life, with a mix of wonder and understanding. The paper had been a compass. She had used it to find her way. And what she had found was this. This land, this man, these children, this community, this life that was entirely her own, and that she inhabited with the full satisfaction of someone who has finally arrived at a place, and found it was everything the long journey had been in aid of. Roscoe, who was not a man who spoke about himself without occasion, said something to her one evening in 1892 that she thought about afterward many times. They were sitting on the porch in the September evening, James Elias and Daniel both in bed, Clara still a toddler asleep in the house, the mesa dark against the starlit sky, and he was quiet for a long while in the comfortable way of their evenings, and then he said, "I think about the morning you came down that road." She looked at the side of his face. "What about it?" "I had been to that well every morning for 7 years," he said. "Same rope, same bucket, same trough. And then one morning there was a woman on the road with a bag over her shoulder asking for me by name, and everything after that was different." He paused. "I didn't know I was waiting for you, but I must have been." She reached over and found his hand where it rested on the arm of the chair and held it, the way she always did. He turned his palm up and held hers back. "My mother knew," she said. "Your mother was a perceptive woman," he said. "She was," Nora agreed. "She was also occasionally very annoying about being right about things." Roscoe made the low sound that was his version of a laugh. "Sounds familiar," he said, and she pressed his hand harder and he pressed back. The mesa was enormous and dark and starred above them, and the desert was breathing in the quiet way of the desert at night, cool now, September cool, and the ranch around them was as settled as the land itself, everything in its proper place. The horses in the stable and the cattle in the north pasture, and the children asleep in their beds, and the kitchen garden putting out its last growth before the frost. 7 years she had carried his name toward him through every kind of weather, through poverty and loss, and the sheer, relentless difficulty of being alone in a world that was not always generous to women who were alone. She had carried it through Missouri winters and Kansas heat, and the long dust-red road into New Mexico territory, carried it in the heel of her boot where it pressed against her foot with every step. She had carried it not because she knew what it meant, but because her mother had told her to, and because she had not had the luxury of anything else to hold on to. She had not known then what she was walking toward. She had not known that the name in the paper was the name of a man standing at a well in the early morning light, a man patient as the land itself, a man who would look at her coming down the road and would ask, simply, whether she had eaten that morning. She had not known that he would give her a room and a seat at his table and eventually his whole life, that he would love her with the same quiet, complete dedication that he brought to everything he chose to value. She had not known any of it. She had just walked toward it. And here she was. Here they both were, in the long good evening of a life they had made together, on the porch of a house in the red country of New Mexico, with 3 children inside and a well down the road, and the mesa breathing in the dark and all the stars. James Elias grew into a boy who was his father in miniature, serious and attentive and possessed of a natural affinity for the land that Roscoe recognized and quietly, deliberately, began to teach. By the time James was 8, he could ride with confidence and was learning the management of the cattle with the absorption of someone who has found the work he was born to. He asked questions constantly, not the scattered questions of a restless child, but the specific, precise questions of someone who wanted to understand the mechanics of things. And Roscoe answered every one of them with the same patience and completeness he brought to everything. Daniel was different, which was its own kind of gift. A child of enormous sociability and humor who seemed to know everyone in Cielo Rojo by name before he was 5, who wanted to know the story of everyone he met, who made friends with a naturalness that still occasionally made Nora and Roscoe look at each other over his head with expressions of affectionate bewilderment. He would be a different kind of man than his father or his brother, and that was entirely wonderful. Clara was something else again, her own complete person from the beginning, observing the world with her father's steady eyes and forming opinions about it that she expressed in the clear, unembellished way of someone who had been raised by parents who both believed that accurate, direct speech was a virtue. She loved the horses with a passion that exceeded even her brother's interest in them, and by the time she was 4, Roscoe was lifting her onto Corazon's back and walking her around the paddock while she sat very straight and held the mane with small, serious hands. The Quilting Circle in 1893 began a project that Nora proposed, a community quilt, each woman contributing a square that represented something of her family's history in the territory, something of the land or the life or the people. Nora's square had a desert flower stitched in blue against red, the kind of wild flower Roscoe had once brought her from the arroyo, and she worked it carefully over several weeks while the circle met and talked and laughed and argued gently about the color of the border thread, as quilting circles do. When the quilt was done, it was hung in the church hall, and it was remarkable, 24 squares in different styles and colors and traditions, Anglo and Mexican, and the mixed and complex heritage of a community that was still negotiating what it meant to share a place, still working out the terms of coexistence that would never be entirely simple or entirely resolved, but that were being worked out nonetheless in the daily transactions of neighbors and friends and people who showed up to help when help was needed. It was not a perfect community. No community was, but it was a real one, and Nora was part of it, as real and rooted as anyone. Hector Reyes finally agreed to let Roscoe reduce his workload in 1894, not retire, because Hector did not regard retirement as a reasonable concept, but reduce, which meant he worked mornings and left the heavier physical labor to Pedro Vasquez and the two new hands they had taken on. He continued to live in the small house that Roscoe had built for him at the edge of the property a decade ago, and he continued to appear in the kitchen each morning for coffee, and he continued to speak about the weather and the cattle and the state of the North Fence with the same authority he had always brought to these subjects. He had become, over the years, something that was not exactly family and not exactly employee, and was, in the vocabulary available, simply Hector, which was its own complete category. In 1895, Roscoe's left leg had a bad winter, the old injury troubling him more than usual in the cold, and Dr. Aguilar told him plainly that it would continue to do so, and that there were things he could not push through the way he once had without consequence. Roscoe received this information with his customary undrama and adjusted, ceding more of the physical ranch work to the hands and spending more time on the management and planning aspects, which he had always been good at and which required him to be in the office more, where Nora sometimes found him in the evenings doing his accounts with the ledger books that had always lived on the shelf above the fireplace and that had a history of needing her to reorganize them. She reorganized them. He noted this without objection, and with the slight embarrassed gratitude of a man who is better at some things than others and knows it. She added a small desk beside his in the office, because she was now handling the correspondence that the ranch generated, letters to buyers and suppliers and neighbors, the administrative language of a working ranch in the 1890s. And she found that she was good at it and that she liked it. The ordered world of words on paper, the precision of clear communication. One evening in October of 1895, she found the drawer of her desk sticking, and when she worked it open she found something at the back that had fallen and wedged. She reached in and retrieved it. It was the slip of paper. She sat with it in her hand in the lamplight of the office, and she unfolded it, and she read Roscoe Bristol in her mother's faded handwriting, and she held it for a while. Roscoe came in from checking on the horses, as he still did every evening regardless of his leg, and found her sitting at her desk with the paper in her hands. He came and looked at it over her shoulder without touching it. He was quiet for a moment. "I forgot it was in the drawer," she said. "So did I," he said. She looked at the name in the faded ink. "I thought I might put it somewhere better," she said, "somewhere it won't get lost again." "Where did you have in mind?" he asked. She thought about it. "The family Bible," she said. "In the front, with the family record." The Bristol family Bible was on the shelf with the ledgers. Roscoe took it down and opened it to the front pages, where the family record was kept, the pages where births and marriages and deaths were written down in the careful tradition of families who understood that their history mattered. There was his parents' marriage, his birth, Nora and Roscoe's marriage in 1885, the births of James Elias, Daniel Clare, and Clara in their respective years. Nora opened the slip of paper flat and lay it between the pages, just inside the front cover, where it would stay pressed and protected. Roscoe closed the Bible and put it back on the shelf. He put his hand on her shoulder where she sat, and she reached up and covered his hand with hers. "You carried it all that way," he said. "Worth every step," she said. He pressed her shoulder gently, and she leaned back slightly against his hand, and outside the October wind moved through the desert night, and the stars were up over the mesa, and the house was warm with firelight, and the sounds of their children sleeping, and the name that had been a compass was at rest now, folded into the record of a life that had been made from the arriving at it. Years settled like good soil. James Elias turned 17 in 1904, and was already working the ranch with the full capability of a man who had been learning it his whole life. Daniel at 15 had the personality of someone who was going to do well wherever he put himself, and the teacher in Cielo Rojo was already talking about whether he might go to university in Albuquerque, which was now a real city in a way it had not been in 1885, the territory changing around them as the new century brought its changes. Clara at 13 rode her horses every morning and read every book she could find, and was going to be formidable in any setting she chose, which was something Nora recognized and Roscoe stated plainly and often. Nora looked at the three of them sometimes, in the way parents look at their children when they think no one is watching, with the full weight of feeling that does not need to be expressed because expressing it would be insufficient anyway. She looked at them and thought about the long road, about the boot heel, about the morning at the well. She thought about how a single piece of paper in her mother's handwriting had set in motion all of this entire particular life, and that the motion had carried her through cold winters and hard work, and a long dusty road into the red country of New Mexico, and into a life that was exactly hers. Roscoe was 57 in the early years of the new century, his hair gone silver at the temples and the lines of his face deeply set by years of sun and weather. But he was still himself in the essential way, still the man who drew water at the well every morning with the same patient practiced motion, still the man who listened when she spoke with his full, serious attention, still the man whose rare smile reached his eyes and changed everything. He had a gravity about him now that was different from the gravity of his youth, softer in some ways, more given to sitting on the porch in the evening, and watching the light on the mesa with an expression that she recognized as content. He was content. He had built what he had set out to build, and it was good. She was content too. She was 46, and she had the deep, full contentment of someone who had arrived not just at a place, but at an understanding that the road had not been punishment or prelude, it had been preparation. Every hard year had built the capacity for what came after. Every cold winter in a St. Louis boarding house had deepened her ability to inhabit warmth when she found it. Every step of the long road west had made her arrival at the well on that red sky morning something earned rather than simply given, and that made it hers in a way that nothing merely given could have been. On a morning in the spring of 1906, Nora walked out to the well. She did this sometimes when she wanted a moment alone with the wide sky, though she was never truly alone on the ranch. There was always someone about and always something to be done. But she walked out to the well in the early morning, before the household was fully awake, and she stood at the stone circle and looked down at the water below and then looked out at the mesa and the rising light. She heard his step on the road behind her and knew it without looking, the slight variance in the left footfall that she had been able to identify for 20 years. He came and stood beside her at the well. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. They stood together at the well in the spring light, the same well where she had first seen him standing in the dawn, drawing up the rope with his practiced hands, wiping his palms on the cloth, turning to look at the woman walking down the road toward him. 21 years of living had passed since that morning. The same water was still here. The same light came from the same direction, rising over the same mesa, and they were still here, both of them, standing at the well in the morning. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood like that for a while, looking at the land that was theirs, at the sky that was going from red to gold, at the good solid world of the ranch around them, the fence posts and the distant corral, and the house with smoke beginning to rise from the kitchen chimney where James Elias was up early and getting the stove going, as he did now, taking over the morning rituals with the ease of someone stepping into a role that was always going to be his. "Roscoe," she said. "Nora," he said, the same way he had always said it, like it was its own complete answer. She pressed her hand against his chest, feeling his warmth and his heartbeat, this man whose name she had carried across half the country in her boot, this man who had been standing at this well on the morning she arrived, who had turned and looked at her with those steady coffee-dark eyes and asked if she had eaten that morning. She had come to him with a name on a piece of paper and nothing else, and he had given her everything, a room and a table and a life and himself and the land and the children and the years and the mornings and the long good evenings on the porch and the starlit desert sky. All of it. Everything. She said, "I am so glad I walked down that road." He tightened his arm around her. "So am I," he said, "every single day." The sun came up over the mesa in a full blaze of morning light, flooding the red country with gold, and the desert was alive with it, and they stood together at the well in the center of all that light, and they were exactly where they were supposed to be, exactly where they had been heading all along.